Hi, welcome to the next video in the series of Theory of Teaching and Methodology. And again, we're moving one step closer to a practical application of what I've been talking about in the last 10 videos. And now I will present to you how I set up a training block, what I have in mind when I set it up, and how I then try to implement or to use the questions and ideas that students come up with in lessons to actually structure what I want to do and to put things into order. It would be best if you have a look at how I set up my curriculum and how I define learning objectives first before you watch this video, because then it will just make more sense. I will now kind of assume that you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the spiral curriculum and varying intensities, progressive drilling, progression in general, and introductory phase, development phase, and testing phase will be something that I will explain in this video a bit more deeply. In general, you have to plan things. Setting goals is very important, as I always say at the beginning of the video. And here I will show why it is important to have goals and why you should not pretend to be very open and go into a class and say, nah, no matter what the students come up with, I will address it. Yes, you can do that, but this will only help people who are really, really interested. And especially for beginners, this will be a terrible idea. So there should be some structure for beginners and maybe even intermediate level students, but you can use students' ideas and questions to then develop how you're going to actually go through the different things that you have planned. So first, there's brainstorming phase. So when I talk about guard bottom, maybe we've been doing some positional sparring lately in guard, or I've seen people struggle when they are in guard, that their guard is getting passed pretty regularly. Then maybe I try to think of how I can improve their guard retention. I probably have never done any training block cycle exactly the same way as before, but there are some general concepts that I will always address. There will be some techniques that I will always address, but how I then structure it and the exact order how we address them in the lessons is something that is always different, and also the emphasis is a bit different from time to time. So when we talk about guard retention, then obviously we have to talk about certain concepts. What is a guard? What does guard retention mean? What is a guard pass? And also, how does this actually play a role in grappling in general? Why is that important? Then when we talk about guard retention, of course, we have to talk about this grilled chicken position or shell position, or whatever you want to call it. You will have to talk about how you can move while being in this very, very secure position where your knees are almost in your armpits. Then, on the other hand, when we talk about guard, we also have to talk about when we play any type of guard, that when we establish grips, that we want to have as many points of control as possible. That when we try to establish grips, we also have to address grip fighting in a certain way. So to simply understand what guard is and what happens in a guard. Of course, there's also submissions and sweeps and different passes that we have to address. But the focus should be on guard retention. And in this case, I wanted to emphasize frames and posts. So how to use frames very early and also very late to prevent guard passes, and how to post correctly and position your body correctly in order to prevent people from passing your guard. This would also include pummeling, especially leg pummeling, which is a skill that is quite important. When we then have grips and pummeling, off balancing to set up sweeps and transitioning into different positions, and also to set up counter offense, so submissions from the bottom, becomes very important. And in the end, sometimes we have to abandon the position and move on to another safer spot when we realize that there is no way in actually keeping the guard. Then we should be able to make a good decision and early decision on abandoning the position to actually move on to a different trench where we maybe have then the advantage in tempo. So first is the introductory phase, guard bottom. So this is the defensive, has a defensive emphasis, and this introductory phase is to make clear why this is important in general, to make clear to the students what we are going to focus on, what I expect them to learn at the end, or what I expect them to develop in that time. And I also show them what the framework is. So I will place some restrictions on this whole thing that we call guard. Because when we want to focus on guard retention, we have to eliminate certain factors first to reduce the complexity of what's going on, practice things in isolation, and then put things back together, and then ramp up intensity, speed, and complexity to test in the end. So the context would be somewhat like guard passing, sweeping, and submitting. So I would set up a lesson, an introductory lesson, which I will go into detail in the next video. What guard is, to simply show the different aspects first. And this would also be geared towards passing. So they would spend most of the time working on some kind of passing, so that the students understand why it is important to talk about guard retention. They will find out in this introductory phase how people try to pass guards. Then they will formulate their own ideas and theories, hypotheses even, on how to prevent people from passing certain ways after we have found out how people try to pass. And they will also ask questions or come up with questions that will be answered in this training block or training cycle. So the introductory phase also helps you to actually diagnose which problems people in your classes really have. And then you can later always refer back to these questions and say, see, in the beginning you were asking on how to deal with somebody pulling your legs away and ripping open this elbow-knee space. Today we're going to address exactly that. And so you can go on about the different questions and problems. Next is that they have to understand the two ends of the spectrum. So grilled chicken means I'm lying on my back, having no contact, and then I have the situation where I might be not really lying on my back, a bit more engaged, and have 4 control points on my opponent, so that I am the one who is leading, and everything in between is what they will have to deal with in guard. And in this case I was focusing on the we do not have grips situation, but a different training block was geared towards we have grips already, what do we do with them? So the goal of this training block was to teach them to protect the elbow-knee space against different ways their opponent try to open up that space, and to teach them that they are not tilted too much onto one side, so that their hips are immobilized, so that they understand that it is very important to keep your hips free. And the guard retention part was, again, protecting elbow-knee space on the one hand by becoming a ball, but also by framing. Framing was the emphasis here. So, if we have questions and suggestions after dealing with the passes on how to prevent people from passing, then we can go through the different ideas your students have. Of course, beginners will have different ideas, and often more ideas which are wrong to a certain extent than more intermediate and advanced students. Maybe they have already done a training block on that cycle, and I will try to address this here as well as in the upcoming videos, how to deal with this situation that you have different levels of students who have been through this training block cycle, position, whatever you want to call it, maybe once, twice, or how many times they've been through, it doesn't matter, and how they can still improve while doing something that they already kind of know. For example, in the beginning, in this introductory phase, of course, if somebody has already a firm understanding of what guard is and what the concepts, which concepts apply to guard, then they will not really find out about guard in that cycle, but they might find out about a certain type of guard and how it fits into these concepts. So maybe they will not simply have to deal with open guard in general, but they will then focus on some specific guard, matrix, lapel guard, whatever it is, and do the same tasks, but they will be restricted towards some kind of exotic guard. So then there would be after the introductory phase, where people learn about the principles, concepts, and what guard in general is, and guard passing and guard retention. We will then, there will be people, when you show them passes, and then you tell them, okay, now they want to pass your legs, they will find out that running around the legs is a good option to pass them. And then dive into that elbow-knee space. And when you then tell people, okay, now find a way to not let people dive into that elbow-knee space when they are running around your legs, they will somehow try to frame, either with their arms or their legs. And then you can say, okay, now you found out framing or pushing people out of that space and keep having some kind of frame to keep them out of the space is a good idea. And now try to find out how to actually make that frame efficient, and how to not only frame against the person so that they do not get into your elbow-knee space, but how can you use that situation to then set up your own guard and move on to the 4 control points. So moving from a neutral or a situation where at a disadvantage to a situation where you are in control and where you are the one leading where the fight is going. So then there will be people who frame with a straight arm. Then you can introduce them to where do you actually frame. You let them do the pass around the legs. People try to dive into the elbow-knee space. And while framing, people have then to watch themselves. How do they frame? Where do they frame on the body? And with increasing intensity and speed, which frames are best? And then they will find out that it is best to block the leading edge, depending on what the person is trying to put into the elbow-knee space. It can be a shoulder, shin, or bicep. And that it is best to block with a very straight and stiff arm instead of a bent arm, so that you cannot be out-muscled there, because the bone structure will hold the frame in place. People will also find out about framing with their legs. They will try to push either their shins or their feet against their opponent to keep them from passing around their legs. This would be something that is a bit more early, or happens earlier than the frame with the hands. So they will then find out that the spider hook is a good option to stop people from running around your legs, and that if they have already managed to run around your legs, that you can use a high pummel to re-guard. So if you tell them, okay, now try to, if they don't come up with the solution, you can tell them, okay, now you've worked on framing with your hands to keep your opponent from dropping into the elbow-knee space. We have 2 more limbs dangling around down there. Use them as well. Try to not to use your hands, but try to use your feet and legs to prevent the people from dropping into that space. And voila, they will find out about the spider hookish and high pummelish way to stop people from dropping into that space. Same goes with the collar tie. If people don't come up with the solution of a collar tie, kind of when the person is running around the legs and is very deep and has already passed the knee line, and you cannot really frame with a stiff arm or with your legs, that you then can use a collar tie-ish frame to against the shoulder and collarbone to stop people from capturing the hip line. If they don't get this, then simply put them at the end of this passing. So you tell them, okay, now let them pass already past your knee line, and then try to frame somehow, and they will try to wiggle in their arms into the position. Or you give people, okay, now you've passed the legs, you have your hands and arms wrapped around the person's hip, and the person on bottom has to try to fend the other one off. They will dig their arms in there and start shoving and pushing with their forearms, and they will somehow come up with the solution that it is a good idea to have this collar tie-ish kind of frame. You can also set it up by having some kind of takedown defense intermezzo or something like that, where people then find out about the collar tie, or you remind them of the collar tie in stand-up, while you use the collar tie to defend people from actually getting close to you, and how you can use to create space. And so you can kind of help them find that solution. If you have these different options of keeping people off your body at different distances, you can start micro sparring, so increasing intensity and complexity in a very confined space. So you give them the restriction, okay, you can only run around the legs, you're not allowed to pass over, through, or under the legs. It's just this toreando-ish kind of movement that you're allowed to do. You can pass with your legs first, or shoulder or head first, or arms first, that doesn't matter. And the other person on bottom has to find a way to frame and re-guard. Then for some people it will be enough to actually pick the right frame for the right distance at the right time. Other people might already be good at this, at the timing and picking the correct frame. So then you can say, okay, increase speed, increase intensity. If it still is going fine, or if you're still doing fine most of the time, then try to frame and not go back to neutral, but use the frame and the motion and the space that is created in that situation to then set up your own guard and get to control points to actually start dominating from the bottom there. So adding in one option at a time, and when all the options that we just talked about, the different frames, can be used correctly for the correct situation, then people can open up and transition towards a guard game. Then there might be different things that people come up with, which you then have to address. Maybe some kind of leg pulling motion, like leg drags or toreandos, where you pull both or just one leg, or this throw-by motion of a throw-by pass. And then you can have one, or I would have probably one lesson for each of these movements, where people then can experiment on how they would, on the one hand, keep that grilled chicken position for as long as possible, and where they get when they simply stay in this position as much as possible. And they can also try to figure out so they learn about the complexity of different passes that they will have to fend off. And I will always have, for example, the leg drag version. I will then have them get an idea of how to defend the leg drag. And then they will be allowed to not only use the leg drag, but the person on top will also be allowed to run around the legs again, so that they then have to implement the things that they've learned about frames in the lessons before, so that we add leg drags to the frames, and so that we build up complexity a little bit. Again, if leg drags and frames in combination work fine, then they can again start working on getting their control points back. And if that is working really, really well, then they will be allowed to start grip fighting from after they have successfully done their guard retention. And then we move on to Tornado pull, throw bys, X passes, knee slides, stacking, and all these different options. And there will always be this, okay, now they're trying to run around, you do your guard retention thing with frames, and you're also allowed to use the Toreando now and pull on both legs at the same time, for example. If that works well, in increased complexity, maybe you use Toreando, leg drag, and frames. Or if you're not quite sure about this, you can also go just frames and leg drag, frames and Toreando, and again, moving on towards working on your guard. And so you can add complexity by giving the passer more and more options, which they're allowed to use, and then adding in one after the other in the practice phase. By that, you increase complexity, then speed and intensity, and you increase the time of positional, micro, mini sparring. In this kind, would it be mini sparring in this guard retention, guard passing setting, so that people have more and more time actually doing guard retention. Right at the beginning, it's just the frames. There will be lots of talking about concepts, lots of time trying to figure out what guard passing really is. So there will be less intensity, and the sparring will be reduced to very, very small areas. And then we open up more and more the complexity, and the more complex it is, the more things you have to add in and maybe take out from time to time to make it less complex, to work on certain problems that come up. The more time you will have to spend on actually doing mini sparring or positional sparrings. Yeah, so add in one by one, that's very important. And maybe when you, let's get back one, when you have already added in leg drags and Toreandos and throw-bys, you then take out some of these again to add in the X pass, and then you add in the other variations again. So then you have developed you have developed your students in that very restricted area of just having one person focusing on passing and the other person focusing on retention. Intermediate and advanced students will probably already have started working towards their guard. Maybe if their guard retention is very on point, they could then work on how to use the movement to transition into sweeps right away or transition into submissions right away. But that's depending on the level of the students. But that's how you can teach different levels at the same time, by simply opening up the task, increasing the complexity and the openness of what they are working on, or reducing it for the beginners. At the end of the retention block, I would then talk about when it's time to abandon guard, because sometimes it is not the best idea to insist on guard retention. Sometimes it's best to decide to abandon the position, to get into a better position early without any disadvantages, so that your opponent is again trying to catch up with you. I would also address preemptive framing, so everything in a kind of sitting guard situation, how you can use frames there to prevent or to stop people from pushing you on your back, so that you're not really into the grilled chicken position. And I would also talk about counter offense, so that would be then grip fighting, to prevent people from actually getting any grips. If they don't get grips, they cannot control you, they cannot put you on your back. So you go on your back on your own terms with the already having the grips set, and you can attack right away while people try to pass with sweeps, submissions, and or simply by having the control points. You already have the very, very early stage of guard retention. If you have a good spider guard or De La Riva guard or X guard, you have lots of control points, and that's already preventing your opponent from passing a guard. They will have to strip the grips first before actually moving on into the knee or elbow space. So that people get the full spectrum from grilled chicken all the way to 4 control points, but also the full spectrum from engaging in the guard, grip fighting, and also at the end of guard retention and whatever is going on in guard, how you transition safely into turtle, running man, hawking positions when your guard is being passed. So this would be then positional sparring, where you allow people to add in more and more things. You will probably have to tell beginners more about what they should add in at a certain time. You have to tell them when to increase intensity and complexity. When you watch them positional spar, maybe you will have to tell some couples that they should take a step back and get back into mini sparrings again, before then again trying to do the things in positional sparring if the movements are not sharp enough already. So you use at the beginning we have this topic of guard. We used a broad approach where we looked at what is guard and how do we get into guard. And now we have, after taking a look at guard retention, we now take it back into grappling and the grappling context. And there will be testing. So people will do some regular sparring, not only positional sparring, but regular sparring and rolling. And they will try to implement, or you can look for if they try to implement what you've taught them, or if they didn't really pay attention and they are still getting their guard passed quite easily. When you do the testing, the positional sparring, you should also lead them and help the students to increase complexity one by one. So first you let them fight in guard, then the person on top is allowed to use any pass they want to use. Then the person on bottom will be allowed to not only do guard retention but move into sweeps right away. Then you add in submissions from top and bottom, so that they when they do their guard retention, that they are aware of their feet and that there are leg locks available when they do some guard retention movements. And then what do you do after reguarding from side control, or what do you do in guard when you come from a takedown? So you move into the position that you were working on. It's not like, okay, now you're in guard, do something, but you, in a real fight, you are more likely to have a takedown happening, and during that takedown you will already have to do your guard retention. You have already tried to get your grips, and when you hit the ground, or before you hit the ground even, you have to try to position your body in an advantageous way. So try to not only isolate the position and do positional sparring because there are some transition within that position, but also try to show how to transition into guard from regular or frequently happening scrambles, for example, where you end up in guard, so that people do not know who is going to be on top, who is going to be on bottom, but that it is clear when they are in a guard situation, the top player will focus on passing, the bottom player will focus on retention. And if that is going to work well, then you can again open it up with sweep submissions and so on and so forth. So in general, you want to improve their decision-making process and their intuitive responses or reactions. But thanks to Matt Wuchner, I learned the difference between reaction and responses. Go watch his video as well, so that people actually respond with something that makes sense and that will put them in the more advantageous position. And again, they don't have to learn everything the first time they do it. Maybe the first time they only get to know about that it actually exists, that framing exists, that it is a valuable way of guard retention. Maybe they simply take away the stiff arming framing, and then sooner or later they will find out that just using the stiff arm is not going to help them in every situation, and they will have to find different ways. But then they can recall, we did something with a collar and tie, or we did something where I should use my legs. And after a couple of months, you will go back to guard retention, will come back to guard retention. They will redo this. They will revisit the position and the different skills that are necessary, and they will improve on it. Maybe then they improve in a different aspect, and so they will move up that spiral. And that's why it's important to come back to the different positions and have these important concepts in place, and then add in the different ideas and aspects that students struggle with. In the next video, I will focus on showing examples of training sessions, lessons in specific phases of the training block. So I will show you how I introduce guard retention, what I meant by looking at guard in general, and how I make people come up with questions that deal with guard retention and come up with ideas about guard retention, which I then use in a developmental phase of the training block. How I then approach dealing with one of the ideas or one of the questions at a time in one lesson, and then how I use the testing phase at the end, or how the testing phases grow over this training block, and how they can test different, or how you can test on different levels, so that people understand how much they have improved throughout the training block, but also see where they can still improve the next time when you're going to visit a topic, or if they want to stick with it during free rolling time at the end of a lesson, then they can still work on guard retention, even though during the drilling and instructional phase we've already moved on to a different topic. So see you next time.